This is a special report from ABC News Digital.
I'm Ty Hernandez in New York, and this is an ABC News Digital special report. It took some time, but opening statements are now underway in the George Zimmerman murder trial and have been completed. The former Neighborhood Watch captain shot and killed unarmed black teen Trayvon Martin last February. Now it's up to the state to prove it was murder and not just self-defense, as Zimmerman argues. ABC's Marcy Gonzalez is in Sanford, Florida, with the latest on this controversial case.
Strong opening words from the prosecution.
Punks. These assholes, they always get away. Those were the words in that grown man's mouth as he followed in the dark a 17-year-old boy.
An intense start to the murder trial against George Zimmerman, charged with shooting and killing 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in his Sanford, Florida neighborhood 16 months ago. The prosecution alleging the former Neighborhood Watch volunteer intentionally targeted Martin. Next up, the defense claiming that Zimmerman acted in self-defense, maintaining that the 28-year-old had the injuries to prove that Martin attacked him.
I think the evidence will show that this is a sad case, that there are no monsters here.
One of the key pieces of evidence, this 911 call in which someone is heard screaming for help in the background.
Do you think he's yelling help? Yes. What is your...
The judge making a pivotal ruling this weekend not to allow audio experts to testify about whose voice they believe that is. The determination will be up to the jury of 6 women. They will hear from as many as 200 witnesses in this trial, including Zimmerman's family, forced to leave the courtroom today.
Any potential witnesses, that they're not to listen to any portion of the trial, whether they be at home or here at the courthouse.
But Martin's family is allowed to stay in the courtroom, where they say they'll be each day. Zimmerman could face a maximum of life in prison if convicted. The trial is expected to last between 2 and 4 weeks. Marcy Gonzalez, ABC News, Sanford, Florida.
And now we're joined by ABC's Aaron Katursky. Aaron, good afternoon to you. Well, we heard the very strong words. Hello, Aaron. We heard that strong language the prosecution used straight out of the gate. What was the jury's reaction?
Oh, they were forced to pay rapt attention from the moment that John Guy, the prosecutor, started using the obscenities, quoting directly from the phone call that George Zimmerman made to the non-emergency line of the police department that night, February 26, 2012. And from there on in, he said that those were the words that were in George Zimmerman's mind when he confronted Trayvon Martin, again using the prosecution's version of events, and initiated a confrontation that ultimately led to Martin's shooting death. And he said that this was not self-defense, that Trayvon Martin was shot not because George Zimmerman had to do it, but because prosecutors said, Tina, he wanted to do it.
Now, by contrast, when George Zimmerman's defense attorney had his turn, he tried to lighten the mood up. We're going to play the sound now to show you that contrast.
Well, I think the evidence will show that this is a sad case, that there are no monsters here. Sometimes you have to laugh to keep from crying. So let me, at considerable risk, let me say, I'd like to tell you a little joke. I know how that may sound a bit weird in this context under these circumstances, but I think you're the perfect audience for it. As long as you if you don't like it or you don't think it's funny or inappropriate, that you don't hold it against Mr. Zimmerman. You can hold it against me if you want, but not Mr. Zimmerman. I have your assurance you won't. Here's how it goes. Knock, knock. Who's there? George Zimmerman. George Zimmerman, who? All right, good. You're on the jury. Nothing? That's funny. After what you folks have been through the last 2 or 3 weeks? Let's get on to, however, the serious business of why we're here. Let's take a look at where all of this started. George Zimmerman is not guilty of murder.
All right, an interesting approach by Zimmerman's defense attorney there, trying to make a joke, clearly recognizing that it was a chance he was taking because he gave this jury the preamble about the joke. How did it go over?
It didn't seem to go over terribly well. As you could hear, there was silence in the courtroom after he finished telling this knock-knock joke. The jurors apparently unsure whether to laugh or not. It is, after all, a second-degree murder trial. And then the follow-up, he got a little bit of a chuckle, but it seemed to make some of the jurors uncomfortable. Nonetheless, they paid the same rapt attention to Don West, at least at the outset of his opening statement, which is still ongoing. We're in between a lunch break right now, Taina, and he's nearly 2 hours into an opening statement that couldn't be more different in style and substance to what the prosecutor delivered. John Guy being quick and sharp, his voice rising and falling in different cadences and tones and using that very explicit language. Don West is showing charts and graphs and maps and going through why he believes the evidence will show George Zimmerman did in fact kill Trayvon Martin in self-defense. And crucially, he showed a couple of pictures of George Zimmerman's bloodied head. He said that George Zimmerman took quite a wallop that night.
Interesting that the prosecution did not mention race in its opening statement, shied away from that issue.
And they were instructed not to. They were told by the judge they could suggest or say that Trayvon Martin was profiled back on February 26, 2012 by George Zimmerman, but not profiled based on race. So they were prohibited from it. They intimated that perhaps he was profiled for the way he looked, but they did not get into race. The judge, the prosecution, trying to remove the very issue that made this case so crucial and so pivotal, and to hear Trayvon Martin's family's attorney say, make it the civil rights case of the century.
Now, the prosecution was described as aggressive, at one point staring down George Zimmerman, pointing at him. Is this a sign of things to come with this prosecutor?
We've seen the prosecutors be lively and be somewhat bombastic, at least in contrast to how George Zimmerman's attorneys are. Zimmerman didn't appear to flinch at all through the prosecution's opening statement. He maintained a rather stone-faced expression. A couple of times he appeared to shift in his chair, maybe breathe a bit heavier than he ordinarily would, but impossible to discern his full and true reaction to this opening statement by prosecutors that included his own words said back to him with a much perhaps more different intent than George Zimmerman would argue. The prosecutors effectively saying this is what was in his head, these punks, and you heard the explicit language, these, and they get away with it. And this is someone that prosecutors said had in his mind that he didn't want Trayvon Martin in his neighborhood, and he acted on that feeling.
Aaron, you touched on George Zimmerman's demeanor in the courtroom. What about Trayvon Martin's parents? They're there today. They're expected to stay for the duration. How did they respond to what we've seen so far of opening statements?
Well, it was clearly very difficult for Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin to hear the opening statement, especially by the prosecutor when he described Trayvon Martin's final moments and the indignities that his body suffered at the end of his life. And at that point, you could see both father and mother dabbing their eyes with tissues or handkerchiefs. And at one point, Sabrina Fulton had to leave the courtroom as one of the 911 calls was played. But the family says they are committed to staying throughout. They were here for all 9 days of jury selection, and they say they will be here in court for the entire length of the 2 to 4 week trial, buoyed, the family said, by memories of Trayvon Martin's smile.
Now, prosecutors reiterated this is not an accidental shooting. As far as their case goes, that this was murder, what is the burden of proof for the prosecution? Because no one's disputing that Zimmerman killed Martin.
No, not at all. But the prosecutors say it's second-degree murder, and that's a rather high bar. In Florida, it requires the jury to believe that George Zimmerman acted with depraved mind, and that's part of the reason why prosecutors started with the expletives, quoting from that phone call, showing, in their estimation, what was in George Zimmerman's mind the night he encountered Trayvon Martin for the first time. And the defense attorneys are already suggesting that there is beyond reasonable doubt. It's impossible to know for sure what was in George Zimmerman's mind, and they also say they have the the injuries to show the jury, to prove that he was not the aggressor that night. And they started to show that one picture of George Zimmerman with a fat lip, with some abrasions on his head. And as I say, the defense saying he took quite a wallop, and they hope that convinces the jury that this was not someone intent out looking for a fight, but rather someone who was confronted by the 17-year-old who refused to run away, refused to go home, even though he knew he was being followed.
Now, Aaron, there were some pretrial decisions by the judge that could have an impact on the way this goes forward. This weekend, the judge said there will be no expert witness allowed to help the jury determine who was screaming in the background of that 911 call. Was it Trayvon Martin? Was it George Zimmerman? Is that evidence compromised now?
Well, it's not necessarily compromised, but the jury isn't going to have any assistance in helping them figure it out. The lawyers are obviously going to try and present it in a particular fashion. Was it George Zimmerman? Was it Trayvon Martin screaming for help that night? The jury is going to have to be its own expert and decide for itself, and that may go a long way toward convincing them who truly was the aggressor that February night of 2012. But the judge ruled that the evidence itself, the witness testimony, that those audio experts weren't exactly scientifically sound, and their conclusions at best were inconclusive. And so she said that those experts could not testify before the jury. It's going to be up to those 6 women to decide for themselves who is heard screaming, and ultimately, Taina, it may not matter. There may be other evidence presented that is more compelling, but for now, many legal analysts here at court say this is a blow to the prosecution, because had they been able to show that it was in fact the 17-year-old screaming for help, it truly would have undercut George Zimmerman's claim of self-defense.
How long is this case expected to last before it goes to the jury?
Should be 2 to 4 weeks, and we're awaiting the answer to a crucial question for many here, and that is, will George Zimmerman take the stand on his own behalf? Many legal experts here say it's crucial for the jury to hear from the horse's mouth, to hear George Zimmerman say he shot Trayvon Martin in self-defense, that he is not, as his defense lawyer said, a monster, but somebody who was just out looking for his neighborhood and encountered an aggressive teen. But the defense attorneys say this will be a game-time decision, and they have not yet fully decided whether George Zimmerman will testify.
Aaron, we see you outside the courtroom. Do you see any visible support for either Zimmerman or the Martin family out there? Has there been any?
Not really. There's been some over the course of the last couple of weeks, and each family has relatives there to support them. But there's a separate area designated by fences as a protest pen, and there's not a one person in there. As polarizing as this case was and is, and as heated as exchanges became in the initial outset, as angry as people were that George Zimmerman was not arrested immediately, not until 6 weeks later, there's no sign of that here at court, at least not yet. But the judge seems to be preparing for it. Once the verdict comes in, we're told Judge Deborah Nelson's going to hold on to it for a little while, give police all around the state of Florida time to prepare.
All right, Aaron Katersky outside the courtroom in Sanford, Florida, giving us the latest on the trial. Still in opening statements. Aaron, thanks again. This has been an ABC News Digital Special Report. Now back to our regularly scheduled programming.
This has been a special report from ABC News Digital.